Building a login system that's actually safe is where most beginners struggle with. So in this video, we're building a real Spring Boot registration and login system with validation, secured password, and protected APIs. We're also going to be working with JWT tokens, and this is an example of what we're going to be building. First, I want to introduce you to our project here. This is a project that I had built. We have 3 controllers. One is admin, one is authentication controller. The last one is the user controller. The admins here is basically an endpoint, which is basically have hard-coded value of hello admin. It's only authorized for the admin users. For the authentication controller, it is responsible for registering. It's responsible for logging. For the user controller, it's basically just who are the authenticated user? Who are you? The simple response that's related to you. Those are our controllers. Let's get started. I'm gonna be starting with the registration first. What happens when you register? First, we need to provide it with add valid, which comes from Jakarta. What does add valid do? As the initial phase in the controller one, you need to create your endpoints, and most endpoints that you're gonna need initially register and log in. Let's get started by the register one. In the register, we have a request DTO. It consists of full name, an email, and a password. We have also some annotation which help us in order to make sure that the requests that we had received are valid, such as not blank, email, maybe even size. So in the authentication controller, we're using Jakarta, which is through this add valid annotation. We use this annotation to make sure that the body that we had received is valid according to the annotation that we have. That's the entry point regarding the request. Now we have our authentication service that's responsible for the business logic for registering. What happens in the register method in the service layer, we're normalizing the request that we have. What does normalizing registration value here? It's just a static helper method in order to make sure that we have a valid and good email and the password, in addition to normalizing the full name that we have. This is basically what we do. You might say, I don't really want this kind of normalization. It's up to you to decide. For me, I feel like normalizing a value is important. I have also introduced some logging here, so you can ignore this one here, but I just want to give you some information. When you're working with sensitive data, and email is one of the sensitive data, you are gonna need to mask it. What do you mean by masking it? You don't need to show it, you need to hide it. So, for example, if an email contains at, and there is some kind of validation, this means we need to make it mask it in a way, and we're gonna be masking it through asterisk. We're gonna make it similar to this approach in order to hide the data in the logs, because password, emails are kind of sensitive. You would never want to log them in your system. So, getting back to the register, we have normalized our request, we have masked our sensitive data such as email, and now we're gonna be validating if the user exists in our database through our email, because the email is a unique identifier. You can't have 2 users using one email. If that's the case, we're gonna be throwing an error and logging a warning indicating that something had happened. Then we're gonna be working with password. And by the way, passwords here are important. You need to secure them really good. Why? Because here we have password encoder where it encodes the password. From its name, you might saying, how can we encode something? Encoding means here we're converting some value to another value. This kind of conversion happens in 2 ways, where we can encode and we can decode. This is something that's very bad, especially with password, because that means anyone who has that encoded value can decode it. But the password encoder name is misleading, because password encoder actually hashes the password. This is something that you might find it misleading, but its use case is hashing and not encoding. The end goal, it hashes. And hashing means we're converting some value into another value, and you don't know how you can dehash it to the original value. Basically, the hashing function doesn't work this way. You can hash whatever you want into something, but you can never take that something to be the original value. And this is why hashing is used with passwords. So now we have the encoded password, which is basically a hashed password. And now we're gonna be using our mapper here, which is gonna be responsible for converting our DTO to our entity user. This app user is basically, we have table called users, and it has some kind of values. Those values are full name, ID, email, password, and the roles that the user have. The roles that we have are basically role user and role admin. Those are 2 roles that we have. Getting back to the registration. So what happens after the mapping? We're also sending the password, the encoded password, which is the hash one. And let's view how does it work here. The mapper is pretty straightforward. We're just using the builder here. We're assigning some values, and we're passing the encoded password, which is basically the hashed password. And we save the user now through our user repository. And I'm putting some data regarding this user in order to be helpful when it comes to logging. And now the user has successfully registered. And by the way, we're using the masked email because that's sensitive. And we're going to be generating JWT token. Okay, for you guys who don't really know what is the JWT token, JWT token is basically a token which consists of three main components. The three main components happen with each dot. So this is the first part, right before this dot. This is the header one. This is the first component in the JWT, the header. The second part that we have is right before the second dot, which is this part. This is the payload, the body of our JWT token. The last part one is the secret part, the secret that we use. So basically, every time you have a JWT token, we use the secret to generate a key. This is the secret that I had used. And by the way, this is usually a base 64 encoded value. So here, this is the secret that I had used, and this is the output of my, like the decoded base 64. So this is the encoded base 64 secret, and this is the decoded value of it. And if you paste this decoded value, you will find that this is a valid secret, and the signature now is verified. If you try to change it, it will be invalid signature. So that's basically the components of JWT token. Going back to the service that we have, now we have used our JWT service, and this is the service that we had implemented. Let me show you how we're generating the JWT token in code. We're gonna be validating the token input, and we're gonna simple validation, like if the user is null, if there is some kind of wrong value, we're doing this sort of validations that we have. And also we're gonna be resolving is the algorithms. This algorithm is simple switch case because we can use multiple algorithms here. So I just made the static helper method for us. So now after validations, the tokens that we have, we're gonna be doing the generation itself through some kind of, like if you had seen here, we have issuer, we have subject, we have expiration date, we have, I don't know what is this, issued at, which is the date of issuance, email, and roles. So now we're gonna be adding all those into our body. So now we're gonna be creating these roles, and we're gonna keep adding them through JWT claim set. If you view this part, you will find it claims breakdown. This claims breakdown basically contain everything that we have created. So we have the issuer, we have the expiration, which is expire at, and we have the subject, the email, the roles. All of those are what you see here. And the algorithm is what we had used. It's a JWT algorithm that was being provided here. And this is the header part, which is the first part that we have. And now we're going to be using the JWT encoder, which is also going to be responsible for our encoding from our header and the claim in order to get this value. Let's view what happens here. You will find that it comes out originally from Spring Security OS package. That's basically out of the box. It's basically comes to you as a helper message just for you to use. So now we're going to be getting the token value and we're returning it. So what happens when you return the token? Now you have registered the user and you have generated the token for it. And now we're just mapping this all the token to the response that's going to be expected. So if you check the implementation here, we have this authentication response. It has access token, expiration in minutes, and the token type. The JWT token is usually named as a bearer token as well. Some people call it bearer token, but it's eventually a JWT token. Okay, in case of some kind of data integrity violation, for example, some sort of a bad error happened regarding the data that was inserted in the database, we're going to be throwing an exception. So that's basically what happens. You could actually potentially add also another more exception just as a generic, say, catch exception, SE, and you're going to be throwing similar error like this one. Or you can keep it to the exception handler itself. It's up to you to decide if you want a different kind of problem, an exception to be thrown or not. So I'm gonna add it here. For the sake of simplicity, I'm gonna keep it simple as this one. Now this is what happens in the register one. So what happens with the login? So login is kind of a similar behavior to the registration, but completely the opposite, because now you have already registered a user and now we want to sign in using that email and password. So we're going to be normalizing our request. We're masking the sensitive data. And now we're going to be trying to authenticate through the authentication manager. The authentication manager comes from this package, which is basically comes from Organization Spring Framework Security Authentication. That's coming from Spring Framework itself. So it happens here. We're going to be providing it with username and password through the email and the password that is being provided in the login request input. That's basically the email, which should be valid email and not blank, and also the password, which shouldn't be blank. By the way, the password here is plain password. It's not hashed. This is a plain password. And we have provided with email that's being in the DTO. In case of an error happens, we're going to be throwing an exception, especially when it comes to regarding this authentication exception, which basically means that some kind of value, either username or password, are wrong. What this actually authentication manager authenticate does? I'm going to go now with something called custom user details service. We're saying here, load user point. This implement user details service, which also comes from Spring Framework security. Why? Because it loads the user by username, which in our case is the email. So what happens here? We're normalizing the email that we had retrieved. And if it's null, then we're going to be saying, hey, this username doesn't really exist. If it bypasses this part, this means that we have a valid username, which in our case is an email. Then I'm going to be trying to find by email, which is the normalized email that we have. And if it's empty, I'm going to be saying, hey, also this is something wrong. And eventually we're going to be getting the email that we had retrieved, which is basically a user details. The user detail is something that's coming from a Spring Framework. Our app user isn't really Spring Framework. But what happens here, we'll implement the user details because we want to use the Spring Framework for us to be responsible for the logging part. So now we have talked about the authentication part. After this step from Spring Framework, what happens? We're saying, hey, we want to find this user candidate. And when we find it, if it's not there, then we're going to be saying this invalid credential exception, which is basically of similar behavior through whether we're talking about this part here, which is username not found, because this is an invalid credential as well. But for some reason it is not there, we're going to be invalidate this part and we're going to get the user that we have. And I'm going to be adding some parts just for the logging sake. And we're generating the JWT token similar to the registration part. And then we're mapping it to be the response expected to, which is basically the same response as registration part. That's basically how you register and log in. Before I just jump into the demo, I want to show you some parts regarding the security configuration because it's kind of important here. I have walked you through the JWT service. I have walked you with customer user details service. I'm going to be talking about security configuration. Security configuration here is basically a configuration that's related to Spring Framework when it comes to authentication and authorization. So here we have the user details service, which comes also from Spring Framework. We have also REST authentication entry point, and this an entry point that's coming from this part, Spring Framework security as well, and REST access denied handler. I'm also going to be speaking about REST authentication entry point and REST access denied handler. Both of them are classes that I had created that are related to some Spring Framework interfaces, which, for example, this one is related to authentication entry point, and this one is also related to access denied handler, which comes from Spring Framework security. So what happens here? Those are the secret values that we use in the JWT. This is the issuer, and this is the algorithm that we have. Also, this one is not really needed. Let's remove it because I have a default value in the application label. So we have the security chain here. This is an important part. What happens here? We're saying cross-site. I keep forgetting its name, like it's some kind of forging of some sort of stealing part. And when we're talking about login, the user is not even authenticated yet. So basically, there is nothing that can be stolen because it happens when there is a form. So CSRF here, it's basically a security way when it comes to forms. That's a whole different topic. Maybe we can discuss it in the later future videos. But so far, we're going to be disabling it because we don't really need it in our formula. So here we're just disable also our configuration for the form login because we're going to be using our Postman for this. We're disabling the form login because by default we have a /login, which is a form that you can insert username and password. We're disabling it. Also, we're disabling the basic authentication. Basic authentication is a different kind of authentication than the bearer token. So basically you have a username and password, and between them is a column. We're disabling this part. We also, in the session management, we're using a JWT token. And when you're working with a JWT token, this means you're working with a stateless APIs. So basically the APIs that you have everything it needs in order to complete its work. And this is why we're using a stateless here. We're also now going to be authorizing any request when it comes to the authentication part. This means the registration and login part. And for the admin part, we only want the people who has role admin. Then we want any request to be authenticated. So any request other than the previous two needs to be authenticated. And for the exception handling here, what happens when we're talking about authentication entry point, like some error happens with authentication? We want this REST authentication entry point. And if you open it here, what does it do? It logs some information. We're creating an response DTO, and basically we're using the object mapper to write a value with a status code of unauthorized. That's basically what it does. So in case of authentication failure, we're going to be writing this JSON in the response body. That's basically the REST authentication entry point that implements the authentication entry point, which comes from Spring Framework Security. So what about the access denied handle? So basically one for 401 and the other one is 403. So they are kind of similar, but one for the unauthorized and one for the forbidden one. So you might be trying to access a resource that you're not allowed to. This is a forbidden action. You're authenticated, you're authorized to some other stuff, but you're forbidden for this resource. So in the access denied resource here, what happened is similar behavior. We have this DTO which we were creating with forbidden status, and we're just returning this JSON. Also, we're going to be using the authentication for, I believe it's going to be used for logging. Yeah. This is also being used for the logging part. We can talk about this authentication principle in later video because we have more data, but just a sneak peek. Authentication is a big component. Principle is smaller than authentication. So maybe we can talk later in more details about this part, but if you're interested, you can tell me in the comment section. We're also defining, hey, this is OAuth resource server, and we want the JWT converter to be used. What JWT converter? This is the converter that we'll be talking about. We want this converter to be used. We want the authorities claims to be used. So we want the roles key. So when we have a JWT token, we're going to be comparing it with the key called roles. So if the role that was asked for example, is role user, and this one has role admin, which is not role user, this is a problem, and it should be saying unauthorized because that's not allowed. And basically, we're just going to be returning this converter. And yeah, that's basically what happened. We have also authentication provider, which is a data access object authentication provider. We're going to be passing is the user detail service, which what happens here is simple user detail service, which we had implemented, by the way. And I want to show you here. This is the implementation of the things that we have. So basically, we're using so when we're auto wiring this part, this means we're going to be auto wiring our service that is custom user detail service, and we're passing the password encoder, which is not an encoder, which is a class that is responsible for hashing. This is the authentication manager, which we had already seen before, that was responsible for our login. The JWT encoder, this is just an encoder for the JWT using our secrets that we're going to be using. That's a secret we have to define in the application YAML. Yeah, and this is a JWT decoder, which decodes based on the encoder. So this is an encoder, this is a decoder. There is nothing fancy about it. And those are just some kind of secret values that are going to be used. So yeah, that's basically it. This is the YAML file that we have. And let's get started with the demo. I'm going to be launching this project. It's most probably going to fail. You might be wondering why. Because here we're going to be using a database. The database here is a Postgres database. So what happens here? I have created a Docker compose that you can use also simply through simple command, which is docker compose up, and I'm going to run it through the background, which is /d. So it creates our components here in the Docker compose. If you open it, you will find this relogin. And now if you open the PG admin, here I have already created this connection. It's going to be localhost, but this is a port, and this is a username and password, and those are what you can find here in the Docker compose. This is a username, this is a password, and this is a DB as well. And when you connect it, you will find the tables so far are empty, and we have this relogin system. So now we can run our project. So I'm gonna rerun again after the Docker compose up. Okay, application had run now. Let's clear all this out. I've also prepared a runner here. You can click it here and run, and it will be working fine. Let me show you in a moment what I'm going to be talking about. If you try to run here, I'm going to be run manual, and you will find some test cases, which is going to be success. So all the test cases that we have is a pass. And if you now open this pgadmin, you refresh this one here, you will find that the user had been created. And if you want to view the columns here, you will find out we had a user with a password, and we have a role, we have full name, and an email. And now if you open just one by one, this is the base URL, this is the full name, and this is the email, and this is the password. The password is just password 123, while it should be hashed in the database, and that's actually what happened. This is a hashed password, this is not the actual password 123. So now I'm going to be trying to log in here. So I'm going to be logging through the username and password, which is this password, by the way. So I'm going to be logging here. You will find that I have this bearer token. And if I'm going to copy it here, you'll find that, hey, this is a role user, which comes from this database as a role user. And also it is gonna be expired in 15 minutes. So now what happens if I try to register one more time as a duplicate? So I'm gonna do this one here, find the status of 409 conflict. And if I try to enter a wrong password, like this one, this is a wrong password, I'm gonna put in 401 unauthorized because this is an invalid email or password. Now I want to get who's the authenticated user now. By the way, the access token is automatically populated here because when you're logging here, we have a post script. If this JSON accent is not null, we're just gonna add it in our variable. So this is basically the new tokens that we have. So now I'm also gonna put this is also the authorization tokens that was used. Now I'm gonna be running it, user me. I'll find out this is the authenticated user with the role, with all the kind of data. And if I'm gonna be trying to get current user with no authorization, like there is no authorization here, you will find out this is something unexpected because authentication is required to access resource. And authentication comes from the bearer token. And if I try to access the admin resource here, you will find out, hey, this is a forbidden because you don't have permission for this resource. So what happens if I change this role user to role admin, and I'm gonna be saving it, and I'm gonna be running it again? Guess what? You will find it also 403 and forbidden. You might be wondering why. Because the access token that is being used here is the same access token here. It never changed because it is a stateless application. So what happens now, we need to generate another one with a new access or basic new role to be more specific. So now I'm going to be taking this port and I'm going to put it here. I want you to pay attention to this role user. Guess what? It's going to be role admin now. And this is because we changed it in our database. And after running the login, it's going to be supposedly changing it in the access token. And now if I'm going to be sending it, I will find hello admin as okay. That's basically our demo so far. Hopefully you enjoyed everything here. And by the way, these are the logs which are being used in order to identify what's happening. So for example, if you want to find a flow of events, that's basically what happens here. This is a flow of events in order for you to identify what happened for this correlation ID or a user ID, which are just used for logging sake. That's basically the video so far. Hopefully you have a better understanding of how an authentication happened with a username and password. If you're interested in email verification and forgetting a password, feel free to comment it out and I will be making another video regarding this topic. See you next time.